February 8th, 1934, 11:47 p.m. The warehouse door creaked open, and for a moment there was only darkness, cold air, the smell of oil and rust. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing off concrete walls. Inside, 15 men turned their heads. They were armed. Maps spread across a table, churches circled in red ink, businesses marked for destruction, families targeted. They'd chosen this place carefully isolated, industrial, far from witnesses, close to the river, close to escape routes. They thought they were untouchable. They were wrong. Bumpy Johnson stepped into the light, alone. No crew behind him, no backup waiting outside, just him, 28 years old, calm, focused, unflinching. The room went silent. 15 armed Klansmen, one man. The math didn't make sense. But Bumpy wasn't there to negotiate. He wasn't there to warn them. He was there to send a message so loud, so brutal, that it would echo across New York, New Jersey, and every shadow where hatred tried to hide. He didn't bring a crew. He didn't bring backup. He brought a message. What kind of man walks into a room full of armed Klansmen, alone? The kind who understands that fear only works when it goes unanswered. The kind who knows that respect isn't requested, it's enforced. The kind who would rather die standing than let his people live on their knees. What happened in the next 10 minutes would become legend. 12 men would never leave that basement. 3 would be spared not out of mercy, but to carry the story. By morning, the warehouse would be ashes. The official report? Accidental fire. No arrests. No investigation. But Harlem would know the truth. And so would the Klan. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button. You're about to witness one of the most legendary moments in Harlem history. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story reaches. This is the night Bumpy Johnson walked into hell and came out a legend. To understand what Bumpy Johnson did that night, you have to understand what Harlem was living through in 1934. This wasn't just hard times. This was survival mode. The Great Depression had ripped through America like a hurricane, and black communities were hit first and hit hardest. Jobs disappeared overnight. Families who'd scraped together enough to rent a decent apartment were suddenly on the street. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Mothers watered down soup to make it last 3 days instead of 1. Fathers took any work they could find, if they could find it at all. Harlem, once vibrant and full of hope during the Roaring '20s, had become a pressure cooker of desperation. The music still played in the clubs, but behind closed doors, people were barely holding on. Rent was due. Bellies were empty, and winter didn't care how broke you were. But poverty wasn't the only enemy. There was something else lurking in the shadows. Something that fed on fear and thrived in silence. The Ku Klux Klan. Now, when most people think of the Klan, they picture the South white hoods, burning crosses in open fields, lynch mobs operating with impunity. And that was real. But what a lot of people don't know is that the Klan was also active in the North. In cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit. They just operated differently. No public marches, no grand rallies. They moved quietly, strategically, like a disease spreading in the dark. In Harlem, they used intimidation as their weapon. A cross would appear on a rooftop burning bright enough for the whole block to see. A message, a warning. We're here, we're watching. Anonymous threats slipped under doors. Typed letters with no return address. Leave, or else. Families would wake up to find their windows smashed, their storefronts vandalized, their children followed home from school. And the worst part? The police did nothing. Some officers looked the other way, claimed they didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, couldn't do anything. Others? Rumor had it they sympathized, maybe even participated. There were whispers, never confirmed, always denied that some of New York's finest wore a badge by day and a hood by night. So when a black family reported a threat, they were met with shrugs, paperwork that went nowhere, promises that meant nothing. The message was clear: you're on your own. Harlem's pastors stood in their pulpits every Sunday, preaching courage and faith. Do not be afraid, they said. The Lord is with us. But when the service ended, Those same pastors locked their church doors with heavy chains. They walked home in groups. They kept lights on all night. Parents stopped letting their kids play outside after dark. Neighbors formed walking groups. No one traveled alone. Women clutched their purses tighter. Men carried whatever they could for protection, knowing full well that if they used it, the law wouldn't be on their side. Fear became routine, and that's exactly how terror works. It doesn't need to strike every day. It just needs to make you think it could. It needs to live in your mind, in your chest, in the pit of your stomach, every time you hear footsteps behind you. The Klan understood this. They didn't need to burn down every building. They just needed to make Harlem feel like it could happen at any moment. But here's the thing about Harlem. It wasn't defenseless. See, while the police turned their backs and the city pretended not to notice, Harlem had its own system of protection. It wasn't official. It wasn't legal. But it was real. And at the center of it was a man named Bumpy Johnson. What time is it where you're watching? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how global this community is. Now, to outsiders, Bumpy was just another gangster, a numbers runner, a street hustler tied to the underworld, someone the newspapers would call a criminal without a second thought. But to Harlem, he was something else entirely. He was the guy who paid rent for families about to be evicted, the one who made sure widows had food on the table, the man who walked into a police precinct and told corrupt cops to stay out of his neighborhood and made sure they listened. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for someone else to step up. He saw a need, and he filled it. Bumpy believed in respect, but not the kind you beg for, the kind you enforce. When outside gangs tried to muscle into Harlem, they were met with swift consequences. When loan sharks tried to prey on desperate families, Bumpy made sure they understood the cost of doing business in his territory. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. But he was protection. And in 1934, when the Klan started escalating their campaign of terror, Bumpy saw it for exactly what it was: an invasion. These weren't just random acts of hatred. This was organized, calculated. The threats were getting bolder, the attacks more frequent, crosses burning, stores smashed, families targeted. And then the intelligence came. Quietly. The way information always moved in Harlem, through barbershops, back rooms, trusted voices. 15 armed Klansmen, meeting in secret, planning something big. Not just threats this time, coordinated attacks, churches, businesses, families. They were mapping it all out, preparing to strike multiple targets at once. A show of force designed to break Harlem's spirit once and for all. The location? An abandoned warehouse near the Harlem River. Industrial, isolated, far from witnesses, close to escape routes if anything went wrong. They thought the location made them untouchable. They thought wrong. Because while they were planning in the shadows, Bumpy Johnson was planning too. And his plan was simple. Walk in, send a message, make sure they never came back. No negotiations, no warnings, no second chances, just a reckoning. Before we go any further, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was. Because the legend can overshadow the man. And the man? He was far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more necessary than any legend could capture. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to everyone as Bumpy, was born in South Carolina in 1905. He didn't grow up in Harlem. He arrived there as a teenager, running from trouble, looking for opportunity, trying to carve out a life in a city that chewed people up and spit them out daily. He was short, compact, unassuming at first glance, but there was something in his eyes, a sharpness, a calculation that made people pay attention. He didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. He just needed to be the most certain. And Bumpy was always certain. By the time he was 28 years old, he'd already built a reputation that stretched across Harlem and beyond. He ran numbers, the underground lottery that kept money flowing through black neighborhoods when banks wouldn't give loans and legitimate businesses wouldn't hire. It was illegal, sure, but it was also survival. It was community. It was one of the few ways black families could make a dollar stretch or catch a break when luck finally turned their way. But Bumpy wasn't just in it for the money. He understood something that a lot of people missed. Power without purpose is just noise. And Bumpy had purpose. He saw himself as Harlem's protector. Not because someone appointed him, not because he wanted glory, but because someone had to be, and he was willing to do what others couldn't or wouldn't. When families were facing eviction, Bumpy paid their rent. No fanfare, no press, just a quiet knock on the door and an envelope with enough cash to keep the landlord at bay for another month. When a widow couldn't afford to bury her husband, Bumpy covered the funeral costs. When kids were going hungry, food showed up. No questions asked. He moved through Harlem like a shadow with a conscience. People knew his name, but more importantly, they knew his word. If Bumpy said something would happen, it happened. If he made a promise, he kept it. If he drew a line, you didn't cross it. Not unless you wanted consequences. And those consequences, they were swift, they were certain, they were unforgettable. Corrupt cops learned quickly that shaking down Harlem businesses came with a price. Bumpy didn't file complaints. He didn't write letters to the mayor. He walked into precincts, looked dirty officers in the eye, and made it clear. Stay out of my neighborhood, or I'll make you wish you had. Most listened. The ones who didn't? Well, they didn't stay cops for long. Transfers, resignations, sudden early retirements. Bumpy had a way of making problems disappear without ever raising his voice. Outside, gangs, white mobsters trying to muscle in on Harlem's numbers racket quickly realized that Bumpy Johnson wasn't someone you could intimidate. He didn't negotiate from a position of fear. He negotiated from a position of strength. And if negotiation didn't work, he made sure the message was delivered in a language everyone understood: respect. But not the kind you ask for politely, the kind you enforce, the kind you earn by being willing to stand alone when everyone else runs, the kind you build by protecting your people, no matter the cost. Bumpy believed that respect wasn't given, it was taken. And once you had it, you defended it. Fiercely, without hesitation. To the outside world, he was a criminal, a gangster, a thug. The newspapers painted him that way. The police files labeled him that way. History, for a long time, remembered him that way. But to Harlem, he was something entirely different. He was the man who walked the streets at night, making sure people got home safe. He was the one who settled disputes before they turned bloody. He was the enforcer of an unwritten code. We take care of our own. In a world where the law didn't protect black people, where police looked the other way, where justice was a luxury reserved for those who could afford it, Bumpy became the law. Not perfect, not always right, but present, reliable, unshakable. He didn't wear a badge. He didn't carry a Bible. He carried something more powerful, the trust of his community. And that trust wasn't blind. People knew what Bumpy was. They knew he ran illegal operations. They knew he had blood on his hands. They knew he operated outside the boundaries of what society called acceptable. But they also knew this. When trouble came, Bumpy didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't make excuses. He showed up. And in 1934, when the Ku Klux Klan started terrorizing Harlem, burning crosses, smashing windows, threatening families, Bumpy saw it as more than just crime. He saw it as war, an attack on his people, an invasion of his territory, a challenge to everything he'd built, everything he stood for. And Bumpy Johnson didn't lose wars. He didn't believe in half measures. He didn't believe in sending warnings. He believed in making examples, in drawing lines so clear, so brutal, that no one would ever think about crossing them again. So when intelligence reached him about 15 armed Klansmen meeting in a warehouse, planning coordinated attacks on Harlem's churches and businesses, Bumpy didn't call a meeting. He didn't gather his crew. He didn't strategize for weeks. He made a decision. He would go alone. Not because he didn't have people who would have followed him into hell. He did. But because this message needed to be singular, personal, unmistakable. One man, one night, one reckoning. The kind of move that separates legends from everyone else. The kind of move that changes history. The intelligence came the way it always did in Harlem, quietly, through trusted channels, passed from hand to hand until it reached the right ears. And in early February 1934, it reached Bumpy Johnson, 15 men, armed, meeting in secret. Not just talking, planning. The Klan had been operating in the shadows for months, testing Harlem's limits, burning crosses, smashing windows, slipping threats under doors, watching to see how far they could push before someone pushed back. But this was different. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was preparation for war. The details were specific, disturbingly so. They had maps, hand-drawn layouts of Harlem's streets, churches circled in red ink, places where families gathered, where hope was preached, where community was built. Businesses marked with X's, black-owned shops that had survived the Depression, that represented progress, that symbolized resilience. They weren't just planning random acts of terror. They were planning a coordinated strike, multiple targets, same night, maximum damage, maximum fear. The goal was simple: break Harlem's spirit, remind black families that even in the North, even in New York City, they weren't safe, that hatred could reach them anywhere, that no amount of progress, no amount of community, no amount of hope could protect them from the reach of white supremacy. They wanted to send a message that would echo for years. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated who was listening. The meeting location was carefully chosen. An abandoned warehouse near the Harlem River. Industrial zone. No residential buildings nearby. No foot traffic after dark. Thick walls. Few windows. The kind of place where you could talk freely without worrying about eavesdroppers. It was isolated. Far from witnesses. Close to the water. Close to escape routes if anything went wrong. They could slip out, disappear into the night, be across the river, and into the Bronx before anyone even knew they'd been there. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was a trap they'd built for themselves. Because while they were planning in secret, Bumpy was planning too. And his network, the people who swept floors, delivered goods, worked the docks, moved through the city unseen and unnoticed, saw everything. A warehouse that should have been empty suddenly had activity. Vehicles arriving after midnight. Men in plain clothes, trying not to draw attention, but standing out precisely because they were trying so hard not to. Harlem had eyes everywhere. And those eyes reported back. 15 men. Armed with pistols, rifles, maybe more. Meeting on the night of February 8th. Final preparations before the attack. When Bumpy received the information, he didn't hesitate. He didn't call a meeting with his crew. Didn't gather his most trusted men to strategize, didn't spend days planning a counter-operation. He made a decision in seconds. He would go, alone. That night, some of his people tried to talk him out of it. 15 armed men? That wasn't a fight, that was suicide. Even Bumpy Johnson, as skilled and as feared as he was, couldn't walk into a room outnumbered 15-1 and expect to walk out. But Bumpy wasn't thinking about odds. He was thinking about message. See, if he brought a crew, 10, 15, 20 men, and they stormed the warehouse, sure, they'd win. Numbers would prevail. But that's all it would be. A gang fight, a turf war. Something the clan could spin, could rationalize, could recover from. But one man walking in alone, facing 15 armed clansmen, and walking out victorious, that was something else entirely. That was myth. That was legend. That was the kind of story that would spread like wildfire, that would be whispered in barbershops and pool halls, that would reach every corner where the clan thought they could operate safely. That was fear, turned inside out. Bumpy understood psychological warfare better than most generals. He knew that the clan's power came from fear, from making people feel helpless, outnumbered, defenseless. So he would flip the script. He would make them feel helpless, make them realize they weren't untouchable, make them understand that Harlem wasn't just another neighborhood they could terrorize without consequence. This wasn't just about stopping one attack. It was about ending the campaign entirely, about drawing a line so clear, so brutal, that the clan would never cross it again. And for that kind of message, it had to be personal, singular, unforgettable. So on the night of February 8th, 1934, while 15 Klansmen gathered in that warehouse, confident in their plans, secure in their location, certain of their safety, Bumpy Johnson prepared to walk into the darkness. No backup, no crew, no safety net, just him, his resolve, and a message written in blood. If you're loving this story, smash that like button, and stick around. What happens next is absolutely legendary. The clan thought they were planning Harlem's nightmare. They had no idea they were about to live through their own. February 8th, 1934. 11:30 p.m. The temperature had dropped below freezing. The kind of cold that bites through your coat and settles in your bones. The kind that makes your breath hang in the air like smoke. Bumpy Johnson walked alone through the industrial district near the Harlem River. No car, no driver, just his feet on frozen pavement, moving with purpose through streets that had gone silent hours ago. The warehouses loomed on either side, dark, hulking structures that looked abandoned even when they weren't. Rusted metal, cracked concrete, broken windows that stared out like empty eye sockets. This wasn't Harlem proper. This was the edge. The forgotten zone, where legitimate business ended and shadows began. Where the city dumped what it didn't want to see. Perfect place for a secret meeting. Perfect place for what Bumpy was about to do. He didn't rush, didn't sneak, didn't try to hide his approach. He walked like a man who owned the night, because in his mind, he did. His coat hung open despite the cold. His hands were relaxed at his sides. His face was calm, not the calm of peace, but the calm of absolute certainty. The kind of calm that comes when you've already made your decision and accepted every possible consequence. Bumpy had walked into danger before, plenty of times. But this was different. 15 armed men, trained, organized, expecting trouble from law enforcement maybe, but not from a single man walking through the front door. Most people would call this reckless, suicidal even. But Bumpy didn't see it that way. He saw it as necessary. Fear only works when it goes unanswered. The clan had been operating unchecked for months, growing bolder with each threat, each burned cross, each smashed window. They believed Harlem was defenseless, that black people would just take it, that there would be no consequences. Tonight, that belief would die. Bumpy reached the warehouse at 11:47 p.m. It was a 3-story brick building, windows boarded up, loading dock sealed shut. But there was a side entrance, a heavy metal door, slightly ajar. Light leaked through the crack, voices murmured inside. He paused for just a moment, not out of fear, not out of doubt, out of focus. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about sending a message so clear, so undeniable, that it would echo across every city where the clan thought they could operate in secret. Bumpy took one breath. Then he pushed the door open. The hinges creaked a long, metallic groan that cut through the murmured conversation inside. 15 heads turned. The warehouse interior was exactly what you'd expect. Concrete floor stained with oil, exposed beams overhead. A single table in the center, illuminated by 2 lanterns. Maps spread across the surface. Photographs. Lists of names and addresses. And surrounding that table, 15 men in plain clothes. No hoods tonight. No robes, just regular-looking white men who could have been shopkeepers or factory workers or office clerks, except for the weapons. Pistols tucked into belts, rifles leaning against the wall, a shotgun resting on the table next to the maps. They'd been talking strategy, dividing up targets, assigning roles, coordinating timing, and then the door opened, and Bumpy Johnson stepped into the light. For a moment, nobody moved. The clansmen stared, confused at first. A black man? Here? Alone? Then recognition flickered across a few faces. They knew who he was, knew the name, knew the reputation. But knowing and believing are 2 different things. One of them a tall man with a thick mustache. Clearly the leader recovered first. "You lost, boy?" His voice dripped with contempt, with confidence, with the certainty of a man who had 14 armed allies at his back. Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, let them see that he wasn't nervous, wasn't scared, wasn't backing down. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, the kind of quiet that makes you lean in to listen. "You came to my neighborhood." He took a step forward. "Burned crosses on my people's rooftops, threatened families, planned to attack churches." Another step. "You thought you were safe here, thought you could plan your little war without consequences." The clansmen were shifting now, hands moving toward weapons, eyes darting to each other. The math was obvious, 15-1. They had every advantage, but something in Bumpy's eyes made them hesitate. "You made a mistake," Bumpy continued, his voice still calm, still measured. You came to Harlem thinking we were defenseless, thinking we'd just take it, thinking nobody would stand up. He stopped walking, stood perfectly still in the center of the room. Now you're in my house. The leader's hand went to his pistol. You got a death wish, coming in here alone. Bumpy smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a nervous smile. The smile of a man who knew something they didn't. Alone? He said softly. I'm not alone. For a split second, the Klansman glanced toward the door, expecting reinforcements, expecting an ambush. But there was no one there. And in that split second of distraction, everything changed. Because Bumpy wasn't talking about backup. He was talking about purpose. About the weight of every family those men had terrorized. About every child who'd been too scared to sleep. About every mother who'd locked her doors and prayed through the night. He carried all of them with him, and that made him more dangerous than any crew ever could. What happened next would be talked about for decades, whispered in barbershops, passed down through generations, debated by historians who could never quite piece together the full truth because the only witnesses were either dead or too terrified to speak. But everyone agreed on one thing. Bumpy Johnson walked into that warehouse at 11:47 p.m., and 10 minutes later, the Klan's campaign of terror in Harlem was over. What's the weather like where you are? Sunny? Rainy? Let me know in the comments. Violence, when it comes, is rarely the way movies portray it. It's not choreographed, it's not elegant, it's not slow-motion heroics set to dramatic music. It's fast, it's brutal, it's chaos compressed into seconds that feel like hours. And what happened in that warehouse on February 8th, 1934, was all of that, and something more. It was calculated. The leader's hand was still moving toward his pistol when Bumpy moved first. Not with panic, not with wild aggression, with precision. He closed the distance between himself and the nearest Klansman in 2 strides, faster than the man could process. Before the guy could raise his rifle, Bumpy had it. Ripped it from his hands, with a force that dislocated the man's shoulder. The scream that followed was cut short by the rifle stock swinging back around. One down. The room erupted. Men scrambled for weapons. Chairs scraped. Lanterns swayed, throwing wild shadows across the walls. Shouts overlapped commands. Curses, panic. But Bumpy was already moving. See, most people freeze when outnumbered. Their brain locks up trying to process too many threats at once. Fight or flight kicks in, and usually, it's flight. But Bumpy didn't freeze. He didn't hesitate. He'd walked into that room with a plan, and now he was executing it with the cold efficiency of a man who'd done the math long before he arrived. Control the space. Eliminate the threats. Send the message. 2 Klansmen rushed him from the left. One had a pistol halfway out of his belt. The other swung a wooden chair like a club. Bumpy ducked under the chair, let it crash into the man behind him. Used the momentum to drive his elbow into the first man's throat. The pistol clattered to the floor. Bumpy kicked it away, then swept the man's legs out from under him. 2 more down. The thing about fighting multiple opponents is that numbers only matter if they can coordinate, if they can work together, if they can think clearly. But fear destroys coordination, and these men were starting to realize something terrifying. Bumpy Johnson wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't trying to survive. He was hunting. A shotgun blast tore through the air, deafening in the enclosed space. The shot went wide, punching a hole in the brick wall. The shooter was shaking, adrenaline making his hands unsteady. Bumpy was on him before he could pump another round. Grabbed the barrel, twisted it upward, drove his knee into the man's ribs. Felt something crack. The man went down gasping. 3. The leader was shouting now, trying to rally his men. Shoot him! Just shoot him! But shooting in close quarters, in chaos, with your own people in the line of fire, that's how you kill your friends. And Bumpy knew that. He stayed close, used the Klansmen as shields, kept moving, never staying in one place long enough to become a clear target. A knife flashed in the lamplight. Bumpy twisted, felt the blade slice through his coat but miss skin. He caught the man's wrist, bent it backward until the knife dropped, then delivered a punch that sent teeth scattering across the concrete floor. 4. Another pistol fired. This one found flesh, but not Bumpy's. The bullet caught one of the Klansmen in the shoulder. Friendly fire. The man screamed, clutching the wound. Chaos was Bumpy's ally now. He grabbed one of the lanterns from the table, swung it in a wide arc. Glass shattered. Kerosene splashed across the maps, the photographs, the carefully laid plans. Flames caught immediately, spreading across the table in a hungry orange wave. The fire added another layer of panic. Smoke began to fill the room. The temperature spiked. Shadows danced wildly across the walls. 5, 6, 7. Bumpy moved through them like a storm. Not reckless, not wild, controlled. Every movement had purpose. Every strike was deliberate. He broke bones, shattered jaws, crushed windpipes. This wasn't a bar fight. This wasn't about proving toughness. This was about sending a message that would be impossible to ignore. The leader finally got his pistol out, aimed it with shaking hands, fired twice. Both shots missed. Bumpy didn't. He closed the distance before the man could fire a third time, disarmed him with a brutal efficiency that left the leader's trigger finger bent at an unnatural angle. The man howled, dropped to his knees. Bumpy stood over him, breathing steady, not even winded. Around them, the warehouse had become a scene from hell. Bodies on the floor, some unconscious, some writhing in pain, some perfectly still. The fire was spreading, consuming the maps and plans, licking at the wooden beams overhead. Smoke poured toward the ceiling. Of the 15 men who'd been in that room, 12 were down. 3 remained standing, and they weren't thinking about fighting anymore. They were thinking about survival. One of them bolted for the door, made it 3 steps before Bumpy's voice stopped him cold. "Run, and you're dead before you hit the street." The man froze. Bumpy walked slowly toward the 3 survivors. His coat was torn. Blood knotted spattered across his shirt. His knuckles were raw, but his eyes were clear, focused, terrifying. "You 3, he said quietly, "are going to walk out of here." The men stared at him, confused, hopeful, terrified. "You're going to tell everyone what happened tonight. Every Klansman in New York, New Jersey. Everywhere you people hide in the shadows." He stepped closer. "You're going to tell them that Harlem is protected. That if they come here, if they burn one more cross, threaten one more family, touch one more church, this is what happens." He gestured to the carnage around them, the bodies, the blood, the flames consuming their plans. "You're going to tell them that Bumpy Johnson doesn't negotiate, doesn't warn, doesn't forgive." His voice dropped even lower. "And you're going to tell them that if they ever come back, I won't leave survivors next time." The 3 men nodded frantically, too scared to speak, too terrified to do anything but agree. "Now get out." They ran, stumbled over each other in their desperation to reach the door, disappeared into the frozen night, carrying the story with them. Bumpy stood alone in the burning warehouse. 12 men lay around him. Some would never wake up. Others would carry the scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. The fire was spreading faster now, flames climbing the walls, smoke thick enough to choke on. Bumpy took one last look at the destruction, at the maps turning to ash, at the weapons scattered across the floor, at the men who'd thought they were untouchable. Then he walked out, calm, unhurried, like a man leaving a business meeting. Behind him, the warehouse burned. By morning, it would be nothing but charred brick and ash. The bodies would be gone, removed quietly, buried quietly, forgotten quietly. The official story would call it an accidental fire. No investigation, no arrests, no questions. Because exposing what really happened meant exposing the Klan's presence in New York, and the city decided that some truths were better left buried. But Harlem knew. Word spread before sunrise, whispered in kitchens, shared in barbershops, passed along in churches. Bumpy Johnson walked into a room with 15 armed Klansmen, and he walked out alone. If this story is blowing your mind, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe, we've got more untold stories coming your way. 10 minutes. That's all it took to change everything. By the time the sun rose on February 9th, 1934, the warehouse was still smoldering. Thick black smoke curled into the gray morning sky. The smell of burned wood and something else, something darker, hung in the cold air. A beat cop noticed it first during his morning rounds, called it in. Fire department showed up, but there wasn't much left to save. Just charred brick walls and collapsed beams, ash and debris. When the fire marshal arrived to investigate, he found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, no clear cause, just the remains of what looked like an accidental fire in an abandoned building. The official report was filed by noon. Structural fire, cause undetermined, no casualties, no further investigation warranted. Case closed. Except everyone knew it wasn't that simple. The police knew. The fire department knew. City officials knew. But nobody wanted to ask questions. Because asking questions meant getting answers. And those answers would lead to uncomfortable truths that New York City wasn't ready to face. Like the fact that the Ku Klux Klan had been operating in Harlem. Like the fact that they'd been planning coordinated attacks on black churches and businesses. Like the fact that someone had stopped them violently, decisively, permanently. Acknowledging any of that meant admitting the city had failed to protect its black citizens. It meant exposing the Klan's presence in the North, which would shatter the comfortable lie that racism was just a Southern problem. It meant opening investigations that would implicate people in positions of power, people who'd looked the other way, people who'd sympathized, people who might have been involved. So the city made a choice. Bury it. All of it. No arrests, no investigation, no headlines, just silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any confession. But while the official channels went quiet, Harlem was anything but silent. The story spread like wildfire. It started in the early morning hours, whispered between dock workers, who'd seen 3 terrified white men stumbling through the industrial district, bleeding, broken, running like the devil himself was chasing them. It continued in the barbershops, where men gathered and spoke in low voices about what they'd heard, about Bumpy walking in alone, about 15 Klansmen, about 10 minutes that changed everything. It reached the churches by Sunday, where pastors didn't mention it from the pulpit, couldn't. Officially, but congregation members shared knowing glances and quiet conversations after service. It traveled through the beauty salons, the pool halls, the corner stores, the jazz clubs. Every telling added details, some true, some embellished, some pure legend. But the core of the story remained consistent. Bumpy Johnson had walked into hell alone and come out victorious. And more importantly, the threats had stopped. That was the part nobody could deny. The burned crosses that had appeared regularly on Harlem rooftops? Gone. The anonymous letters slipped under doors? Stopped. The smashed windows, the vandalized storefronts, the whispered threats? Vanished. It was like someone had flipped a switch. One day, Harlem was under siege. The next, the siege was over. Families who'd been walking in groups started walking alone again. Parents let their children play outside after dark. Pastors unlocked their church doors during the day. The fear that had settled over Harlem like a fog began to lift. Not because the police suddenly started protecting them. Not because the city suddenly cared. Not because racism had disappeared, but because someone had drawn a line and enforced it. The 3 survivors, the ones Bumpy had let walk out, carried the message exactly as instructed. They told their story in hushed, terrified voices to other Klan members across New York and New Jersey, about walking into that warehouse confident and walking out broken, about watching their brothers fall, about the fire, about the man who'd done it all alone, about the promise, come back, and there won't be survivors next time. The message was received. Klan activity in Harlem didn't just decrease, it stopped, completely. Meetings that had been scheduled were quietly cancelled. Plans that had been in motion were abandoned. Members who'd been active in the area suddenly found reasons to focus their attention elsewhere, because the Klan's power had always been built on a foundation of fear and perceived invincibility. They terrorized because they believed they could do so without consequence. They operated in the shadows because they thought those shadows protected them. Bumpy had shattered that illusion. He'd proven that they weren't untouchable, that their secrecy wasn't protection, that their numbers didn't guarantee safety. He'd turned their own weapon fear against them. And it worked. Word spread beyond New York, to Philadelphia, to Boston, to Chicago, to every city where the Klan thought they could operate quietly in black neighborhoods. The story became a warning. Harlem is protected, and the man protecting it doesn't negotiate. For Bumpy himself, life continued much as it had before. He didn't give interviews, didn't brag, didn't seek recognition. He walked the same streets, ran the same operations, helped the same families, but something had shifted. When he walked through Harlem now, people didn't just respect him, they revered him, not as a gangster, not as a criminal, as a protector, as someone who'd stood up when no one else would, as someone who'd risked everything to defend his community. Mothers pointed him out to their children, not as an example to follow, necessarily, but as proof that they were not defenseless, that someone was watching over them. Old men nodded as he passed, silent acknowledgement of what he'd done. Young men studied him, trying to understand how someone could carry that much weight, that much responsibility, that much danger, and still walk with such calm certainty. Bumpy never confirmed the story, never denied it either. He just kept moving forward, kept protecting, kept enforcing the boundaries he'd drawn, because that night in the warehouse wasn't the end of anything. It was a promise. A promise that Harlem would not be terrorized without consequence. A promise that hatred would not go unanswered. A promise written in ash and blood and silence. And everyone from the families in Harlem to the Klan members hiding in the shadows understood that Bumpy Johnson kept his promises. Silence can be louder than any explosion, and in the weeks and months following February 8th, 1934, the silence in Harlem was deafening. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of oppression, the silence of peace. For the first time in over a year, families went to bed without checking the locks 3 times, without lying awake, listening for footsteps, without wondering if tonight would be the night a cross burned on their roof or a brick came through their window. The change was immediate and undeniable. Within a week of the warehouse fire, the last of the threatening letters stopped arriving. The ones that had been coming regularly typed on cheap paper, unsigned, filled with slurs and warnings, just stopped. No final threat, no last warning, just silence. The Klan members who'd been spotted lurking around Harlem's borders, watching, waiting, planning, they disappeared, vanished like smoke. Meetings that had been held in basements across the Bronx and Queens were quietly disbanded. Members stopped showing up. Organizers stopped organizing. Because fear, it turns out, works both ways. The Klan had spent months making Harlem afraid, making black families feel vulnerable, making them understand that hatred could reach them anywhere, anytime. But now the tables had turned. Now they were the ones looking over their shoulders. They were the ones wondering if that shadow in the alley was just a shadow. They were the ones lying awake at night, remembering what happened to 15 armed men who thought they were safe. The 3 survivors had done their job well. They'd spread the story, told it in vivid, terrifying detail, about Bumpy Johnson walking in alone, about the speed, the precision, the absolute certainty with which he dismantled their operation, about the bodies, about the fire, about the promise. And that promise hung over every Klan member in the region like a sword. Come back, and there won't be survivors next time. Nobody wanted to test whether he meant it. Nobody was willing to be the one who found out. So they stayed away, focused their hatred elsewhere, convinced themselves that Harlem wasn't worth the risk. And Harlem? Harlem breathed. The psychological shift was profound. Parents who'd been walking their children to school in groups started letting them walk with friends again. Store owners who'd been closing early, afraid to be out after dark, started keeping normal hours. Churches that had posted guards during services went back to leaving their doors open. It wasn't that racism had disappeared. It wasn't that the struggle was over, but the immediate, visceral terror, the kind that makes you afraid to exist in your own neighborhood, that was gone. And people noticed. Conversations in barbershops shifted. Instead of sharing stories about threats and close calls, men talked about business opportunities, about plans for the future, about hope. Women gathered in beauty salons and spoke about their children's education, their husbands' jobs, their own dreams, not about survival strategies and escape routes. Jazz clubs filled up again. Laughter returned to the streets. Harlem started to feel like Harlem again. Not perfect, not without problems. The depression was still crushing. Poverty was still real. Discrimination was still everywhere. But the specific terror that the Klan had brought? That was over, and everyone knew why. Bumpy Johnson's legend grew with each passing week. The story was told and retold, each version slightly different, but the core always the same. One man, 15 Klansmen, 10 minutes, total victory. It became the kind of story parents told their children, not to encourage violence, but to teach a lesson. We are not helpless. We are not defenseless. We do not have to accept terror as inevitable. It became the kind of story young men whispered with awe, trying to imagine what kind of courage or madness it took to walk into that warehouse alone. It became the kind of story old men nodded along to, adding their own commentary. That's what real strength looks like. Not loud, not boastful, just certain. The story spread beyond Harlem, beyond New York. In Philadelphia, black communities heard about it and felt a spark of hope. In Chicago, in Detroit, in Boston, anywhere, the Klan had tried to extend its reach into northern cities. The story traveled, and with it came a message. Resistance is possible. Protection is possible. We don't have to live in fear. The Klan, for their part, never publicly acknowledged what happened. How could they? Admitting that 15 of their members had been destroyed by one black man would shatter the myth of white supremacy they'd built their entire identity on. It would make them look weak, vulnerable, beatable, so they stayed silent too. But their silence was different. It was the silence of defeat, of humiliation, of fear. They'd come to Harlem expecting to break spirits and instead had their own broken. They'd come expecting to instill fear and instead learned what it felt like to be afraid. They'd come expecting to send a message and instead became the message. And that message echoed through every shadow where hatred tried to hide. Harlem is protected. Touch it and pay the price. The silence that followed February 8th, 1934, wasn't empty. It was full of relief, full of pride, full of renewed strength, full of the understanding that sometimes one person willing to stand alone can change everything. History has a funny way of remembering people. Sometimes it forgets the heroes, sometimes it celebrates the villains, and sometimes, often, actually it gets the story completely wrong. For decades, Bumpy Johnson was remembered primarily as a gangster, a criminal. A footnote in the history of organized crime, mentioned mainly in connection to bigger names like Stephanie Street, Claire, or Lucky Luciano. The history books focused on his illegal activities, the numbers racket, his connections to the mob, his arrests and prison time. What they left out, what they conveniently forgot, was what he meant to Harlem. They forgot that he was protection when the police offered none, that he was justice when the courts denied it, that he was the line between his community and the forces that wanted to destroy it. They forgot February 8th, 1934, or maybe they didn't forget. Maybe they just chose not to remember. Because acknowledging what Bumpy did that night meant acknowledging uncomfortable truths. It meant admitting that the Klan operated in New York, that the police failed to protect black communities, that sometimes the only justice available came from outside the law. Those weren't the kinds of truths that made it into textbooks. But in Harlem, the story never died. It was passed down through generations, grandfather to father to son, grandmother to mother to daughter. In barbershops, old men still tell the story to young ones. The details might shift. Some say it was 20 Klansmen, some say 10, but the core remains the same. One man, outnumbered, walked in alone, walked out victorious. In beauty salons, women speak his name with a mixture of respect and caution, acknowledging what he was: flawed, violent, operating outside the law, while also acknowledging what he did. He protected them when no one else would. The story became more than just history. It became legend. It became proof. Proof that black communities weren't defenseless, that resistance was possible, that terror could be answered. It became a reminder that sometimes, when the system fails you, you have to create your own justice, your own protection, your own boundaries. Not because it's ideal, not because it's what should happen in a just world, but because survival doesn't wait for the world to become just. Bumpy's philosophy that respect is enforced, not requested, became embedded in Harlem's DNA, not as an excuse for violence, not as a celebration of criminality, but as an understanding that dignity sometimes has to be defended, that communities have the right to protect themselves, that standing up to hatred, even at great personal risk, is not just brave, it's necessary. The night of February 8th became a turning point in how Harlem saw itself. Before that night, the community had been under siege, reacting to threats, living in fear, hoping someone, the police, the government, anyone would step in and help. After that night, there was a shift, a recognition that help wasn't coming from outside, that protection had to come from within, that they had the power to draw their own lines and enforce their own boundaries. It wasn't just about Bumpy, it was about what he represented. The willingness to stand alone when necessary, the courage to face overwhelming odds, the commitment to community over personal safety. Those values outlived him. They showed up in the civil rights movement, when ordinary people faced down police dogs and fire hoses, when students sat at lunch counters knowing they'd be beaten, when marchers walked across bridges knowing violence waited on the other side. They showed up in the Black Power movement, when communities decided that self-defense wasn't just a right, it was a responsibility. They showed up every time someone decided that fear was not an acceptable way to live, that dignity was worth fighting for, that community was worth protecting. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, the same year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Two very different men, two very different approaches. One preached nonviolence and moral authority. The other enforced respect through strength and action. But both understood the same fundamental truth. Black lives have value. Black communities deserve protection. And sometimes, you have to be willing to sacrifice everything to prove it. The warehouse on the Harlem River was eventually torn down, replaced by a parking lot, then a storage facility, then something else. The physical location disappeared. But the memory didn't. Because some moments transcend their physical space. They become part of the collective consciousness. They become stories that define a community's understanding of itself. February 8th, 1934, was one of those moments. It was the night Harlem learned it wasn't defenseless. The night the Klan learned that northern black communities wouldn't be terrorized without consequence. The night one man proved that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being more committed to your purpose than you are afraid of the cost. Today, if you walk through Harlem, you won't find a monument to Bumpy Johnson. No statue, no historical marker, no official recognition. But his legacy is there. It's in the pride people feel about their neighborhood, in the understanding that Harlem has always been worth defending, in the stories still told in barbershops and living rooms and late-night conversations. It's in the knowledge that their community has survived, everything thrown at it, poverty, discrimination, violence, neglect, and is still standing. Still strong, still proud, still Harlem. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a saint. He wasn't a traditional hero. He operated in the shadows, broke laws, used violence as a tool. But he was also a protector, a defender, a man who saw his community under attack and decided that doing nothing wasn't an option. He walked into darkness so others could live in light. He faced 15 armed men alone so families could sleep safely. He became a legend so Harlem could have hope. And that legacy, complicated, controversial, undeniable, lives on. Not in history books, but in the hearts and memories of the people who understand what he really was. Not just a gangster, a guardian.